Create in me a clean heart and purify me. Create in me a clean heart so I.
Next panel is going to continue to build us up and give us some insight to the things that will be going on as we try to combat white supremacy in this context. White Rage is the title of the next book that our panel is going to take us into understanding. The panel leader for this is Travis Stanley. Stanley, I've known Travis for some years now. Travis Stanley is a native of Florida, but has lived 6.5 years in Norwalk, Iowa, where he enjoys 4 seasons and co-pastors with his wife Marty at Norwalk Christian Church. They have 3 children, from ages 14 to 5, a dog, and 6 chickens. 6 chickens. That's okay. He holds degrees from Lipscomb University and a graduate and graduate school of theology at Abilene Christian University. While at Abilene, Travis served as Dr. Taylor's first graduate assistant. Travis grew up in Southern Churches of Christ and is now ordained minister in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. He has ministered in churches in Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, and Iowa. For 11 years, Travis has extensively been involved in institutional, broad-based community organizing, working full-time for several years as an organizer for the Industrial Areas Foundation, or IAF, serving Dallas Area Interfaith and Jeremiah Group in New Orleans, and now serving on steering committees of Amos, a local affiliate of the IAF. Travis is also a 2020 president of the Norwalk Area Chamber of Commerce. Travis has been doing all that, but I remember I first met Travis at a small country church in Abilene, Texas, the North 10th and Treadaway Church of Christ, and I remember some fun years there. So, Travis, I'll toss it over to you.
Thank you, Byron, and good to see you again. And like a lot of people from North 10th and Treadaway are here today, and so it's a good walk down memory lane. It is a pleasure to be here because of Dr. Jerry Taylor, as many of you already said. We're on this program because he invited us, and my life was changed 18 years ago this January when he began teaching at ACU and invited me to be his graduate assistant. And every invitation extended for him since continues to rock my world and really shape my calling as a minister. So thank you, Dr. Taylor, and to the Carl Spain Center. I'm joined today by our panel, whom I'd like to introduce at this time. First, we have Claire Davidson Frederick, who is a faculty fellow in the College of Bible and Ministry at Lipscomb University, where she teaches Bible and ministry courses, in addition to directing the Engage Youth Theology Initiative, a public theology and racial justice institute for high school students. She holds degrees from Rutgers University, Hazlitt School of Theology at Lipscomb, and is a Doctor of Ministry candidate at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. She also spent 15 years as a professional singer and songwriter in the Nashville music industry, taught songwriting workshops at the Tennessee Prison for Women. She's a writer, sought-after preacher, a minister, and 4 years ago, co-planted All Saints Church of Christ in Nashville, where she serves as their liturgist and lead worship minister. She's married to Kyle Frederick, and together they have 2 daughters, 1 son-in-law, 1 granddaughter, and a grandson on the way. So congratulations on that. Claire's, after she shares, will be Dr. Kelli Bryant. She's the assistant professor of historical theology in the Graduate School of Theology at ACU. She has a BA and MDiv from ACU, a Master of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy in Eastern Christian Studies from the University of Oxford, and her research focus is on Syriac Christianity and early Muslim Christian relations. And she and her husband, Ian, live in beautiful Abilene, Texas. And then our other final panelist is Dr. Robert Foster, a senior lecturer in religion and New Testament at the University of Georgia. He also is a proud graduate of ACU as well as Southern Methodist University, both of which he also taught for, along with also at Texas Christian University prior to coming to UGA. He's written extensively on both the Old and New Testaments of the Christian Bible, and his research interests include biblical theology, biblical interpretation, comparative religious ethics, and Christianity and racial justice. He is a fellow in the UGA Center for Social Justice, Human and Civil Rights, co-director of the Religion and Common Good Seminar, and was the recipient of the UGA Black Male Leadership Society Faculty Member of the Year Award for 2015-16. He's active within the Athens community in North Georgia in partnerships focused on racial justice and the rights of undocumented immigrants. And it's a pleasure to be joined with these wonderful people. I met all these folks years ago back at ACU, and it's good to be back together again. The four of us are going to be leading you through this book. I don't have a fancy slide, so I'll just hold up the book, White Rage by Carol Anderson. Carol Anderson's a fellow Georgian like Robert. She serves as the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University and lives in Atlanta. The book was published in 2016, climbed the New York bestseller list and received numerous accolades, and then re-released in paperback version with an extended afterword a couple years later. I mean, it is an incredible book, a book that lays out post-Civil War American history and talks about the systemic oppression of Black America in order for whites to create and hold on to power. It is not a pretty story. It is, in fact, a tragedy, one that, while attempting to elevate whites to supremacy, has actually put every single American at risk and mortgaged our future as a nation. The deadly risk of white rage has culminated in our present moment with a pandemic and the resulting economic suffering. I was just reflecting that this very day, the US Senate could pass landmark legislation that would save workers and businesses, provide resources that would address the pandemic, that would save lives. In my state today, we registered another 1,900 positive cases, most of those in rural white America. But this is not going to happen today or in any day in the near future. Why? Well, Anderson wrote in 2016, but the story she tells is the story we are still living out today, that people are suffering today, losing jobs, businesses, their health and lives because of a virus called white rage. Because if we were to address this present crisis like it demands, like we should, that would mean an unprecedented sharing of wealth and opportunity that would include people of color. And for whites in power, the risk of Black advancement is greater than the risks faced by a novel coronavirus. And as a result, white rage once again threatens us all. Now, Anderson lays bare this repeated historical script of white rage in the United States. She begins by talking about Black rage, and thank you to our panelist who shared so powerfully about Black rage a moment ago. Brother Rogers said, oppressors don't get to tell those they oppress how to rage. And our author also says, we can't rage as white people against Black rage because it is in fact a fire that burns from the kindling that whites created from centuries of our own white rage. White rage, she writes, is not the Klan. It doesn't wear sheets, burn crosses, or doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, or take to the streets. Working the halls of power, white rage can achieve its ends far more effectively, far more destructively. The trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. It's not the mere presence of Black people that's the problem, and this is critical for white people who would claim I'm not racist because I have Black friends. That's not the point. Rather, it is, white rage reacts, the trigger is the presence of Blackness with ambition, with drive, purpose, aspirations, with demands for full and equal citizenship. It's Blackness, she writes, that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. A formidable array of policy assaults and legal contortions has consistently punished Black resilience, Black resolve. All the while, white rage manages to maintain not only the upper hand, but also apparently the moral high ground. Her journey in this research of white rage began back in 1999 with the shooting of Amadou Diallo, a West African immigrant who was murdered by 41 bullets fired by the New York PD. She remembers watching Mayor Rudy Giuliani rage on national news in the aftermath of this, claiming that the NYPD was the most restrained and best behaved police department you could imagine. And the real issue, he said, was the community's racism against the police. and Black New Yorkers' unwillingness to take responsibility for the issues plaguing their neighborhoods. Since that time, people have been quoting Mayor Giuliani as we've raged against the aftermaths in the murdering of Black men and women, most often unarmed. She talks about her own experience reflecting on Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, the same that happened here in Minneapolis with the shooting of George Floyd. And it plays out the same way every time. News across the spectrum focuses on the Black rage, riots, looting, wrangling over whether Brown or Floyd were really innocent. Maybe they deserved it. She says the operative question seemed to be whether African Americans were justified in their rage. Now, white rage is ever present. It is American history. It's our shared script, and it's just as strong now as it was in the 1620s, 1850s, or 1950s. And it was ignited most recently by the ascension of a Black man to the presidency of the United States, which she says is the ultimate advancement and thus the ultimate affront to white people. Since that moment, whites have raged again by gutting voting rights, shutting down the federal government, blocking justices, and derailing an agenda that would benefit all people because it benefited Black people. This illustrates how white rage works. It's not, she writes, about visible violence, but rather works its way through the courts, legislatures, and a range of government bureaucracies. It wreaks havoc subtly, almost imperceptibly. The truth is, she writes, that enslaved Africans plotted and worked hard, with some even fighting in the Union Army for their freedom and citizenship. After the Civil War, they took what little they had and built schools, worked the land to establish their economic independence, and searched desperately to bring their families separated by slavery back together. That drive, initiative, resolve, however, was met with black codes, with Army troops throwing them off their promised 40 acres, and with a slew of Supreme Court decisions eviscerating the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And this hasn't just hurt Blacks. White rage harms whites too. She writes that white rage has undermined democracy, warped the Constitution, weakened our ability as a nation to compete economically, squandered billions of dollars on baseless incarceration, rendered an entire region sick, poor, woefully undereducated, and left cities nothing less than decimated. And all this havoc has been wreaked simply because African Americans wanted to work, get an education, live in decent communities, raise their families, and vote, because they were unwilling to take no for an answer. So I'd like to invite you down this rabbit hole to take that red pill that Dr. Burton referred to this morning. A white rage, this is the portrait of a nation, one that is the unspoken truth of our racial divide, and this is our American history. And I'm gonna turn things over now to Claire Davidson Frederick.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you, and I'm grateful to be here today. So my challenge during this time is going to be basically what not to say about the period of Reconstruction in American history, because this is the period immediately after the Civil War, in which, had we gotten it right, I think it could have changed the course of history regarding where we are today in the US with racial relations. The Reconstruction era was a time of great promise and possibility. The Emancipation Proclamation had finally made its way across all the southern and western states, including Texas, where formerly enslaved persons who had been kept ignorant of the proclamation by landowners who hoped to get one more crop out of the enslaved laborers were finally set free on June 19th, 1865, a day that came to be known as Juneteenth. And so at the close of the Civil War, we did see the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. These included the 13th Amendment, which was intended to abolish slavery and involuntary servitude, except, as it states, in the cases of those duly convicted of a crime. Now, this exception, except for those convicted of a crime, would ultimately be the back door that Southern states would use, not even a decade later, to continue the subjugation of formerly enslaved African Americans through forced labor contracts, vagrancy laws, convict leasing, and worse. But we also saw the passage of the 14th Amendment, which addressed citizenship rights and equal protection under the law for all people. And finally, the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, was intended to prohibit discrimination in voting rights of citizens based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We also saw the creation of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The head of the Bureau seemed to be a pretty decent guy named General Oliver Howard, who had a number of responsibilities, but chiefly Howard wanted to reallocate abandoned Southern lands, leasing 40-acre parcels, that's where we get the 40 acres and a mule, that would provide economic self-sufficiency to African-American people who had endured hundreds of years of unpaid toil. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was also passed at this time. Initially, it was vetoed by President Andrew Johnson, but ultimately it was passed in Congress with near unanimous Republican support. And this also took concrete steps to ensure citizenship and access to land, education, and the courts for the formerly enslaved. As Travis mentioned, Black soldiers had comprised 10% of the Union Army, and they had fought and worked hard for their freedom and citizenship. And after the war, Anderson writes, freed people took what they had, built schools, worked the land to establish economic independence, and searched for their families who had been separated by slavery, hoping to bring them back together. And while the Union soldiers remained in the South from 1865 to 1877, African Americans were politically active, industrious, and they exercised their newfound legal rights. In my home state of Tennessee, for example, Black men ran for local elected offices. We had 13 Black legislators who were elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives. Men from other Southern states actually served in the US Congress during this golden decade. And much of their legislative work consisted of trying to protect the rights Black people had gained during Reconstruction. But as Anderson narrates so clearly in White Rage, anytime African Americans in this nation have exhibited signs of too much self-sufficiency, too much progress, success, or dignity, there are aggrieved white people waiting in the shadows to undo it all. To be sure, every step Black Americans made towards racial equality, including during Reconstruction, was met with white resistance and undone by new and insidious discriminatory policies known as Jim Crow laws and the notorious Black codes. Also, voter suppression and disenfranchisement was a huge piece of rolling back Black rights. Poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, threats of violence, homes burnt to the ground, lynchings numbering in the thousands, and all of it fueled by white rage. Particularly problematic, she states, was both Lincoln and Johnson's lack of clarity about the purpose and cause of the Civil War. Both presidents insisted that the 4 years of bloodshed had been about preserving the Union, no more, no less. It had not been about winning equal rights, suffrage, or citizenship for the formerly enslaved Africans. Now, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat, had grown up poor, white, and illiterate, and he had blasted the Confederate leadership and plantation owners as damnable traitors. And yet, within weeks after taking office, Johnson pardoned scores of former Confederates, including Robert E. Lee, and even Confederate States of America Vice President Alexander Stephens, handing out pardons for these war criminals rather than trials and hangings. And he took advantage, Johnson did, of a long congressional recess in 1865 to put his own Reconstruction plans in place in the former Confederate states, reflecting his firm belief in states' rights. Now, in Johnson's view, the Southern states had never given up their right to govern themselves, and the federal government had no right to determine voting requirements or other such questions at the state level. One Virginian said, once Johnson held up before us the hope of a white man's government, it led us to set aside Negro suffrage and to resist Northern plans to improve the condition of the freedmen. Virginia's rebellion-tainted leaders thus planned to accomplish with votes what they had failed to accomplish with bayonets. Under Johnson, 40 acres and a mule was rescinded, the freed people were run off their newly acquired land, and those plantations reverted to their pre-war Southern owners. His reasoning? Since poor whites in the South had never been helped by the federal government, Johnson did not want the formerly enslaved Black populace getting special treatment or a hand up when it came to land, voting rights, safe working conditions, education, or citizenship. And I think here from Johnson's lips, we may hear the earliest recorded cry of reverse racism. Never mind that millions of enslaved people and their ancestors had built the enormous wealth of the United States. In fact, prior to the war, 80% of the nation's gross national product was tied to slavery. But Johnson's own racism and the anxiety of a region economically dependent upon unpaid labor allowed the promise of the Reconstruction amendments to be set aside. And the Southern states were helped along by a Supreme Court who also permitted discrimination against African Americans in decision after decision. Most notably, the court in the infamous Dred Scott case ruled that Black people have no rights that the white man is bound to respect, a precedent that state governments all over the South took to heart in devising criminal statutes, civil legislation, and Black codes with expressly white supremacist aims. Blacks were systematically denied full citizenship, and most significantly, they were denied access to the ballot through violence, poll taxes, literacy tests, and other unjust means. As noted by W.E.B. Du Bois, the notorious Black codes were an astonishing affront to emancipation and made plain and indisputable the attempt on the part of the Southern states to make Negroes slaves in everything but name. The codes required that Black workers had to sign annual labor contracts with plantation, mill, or mine owners. And if African Americans refused or could show no proof of gainful employment, they would be charged with vagrancy and put on the auction block, with their labor sold to the highest bidder. They were forbidden to seek better wages or better working conditions with another employer. And no matter how bad the conditions, if they left the plantation, lumber camp, or mine, they would be jailed and auctioned off. Self-sufficiency was essentially illegal, as they could not hold any other employment besides laborer or domestic. And these laws ensured that African Americans would be economically and politically powerless, because Black people were also denied access to land, banned from hunting and fishing, and forbidden to work independently using skills they had honed and developed while enslaved, such as blacksmithing. The penalties for defying the Black codes included whippings, imprisonment, and public lynchings. Slavery itself, as Brian Stevenson has often said, morphed into a system of convict leasing. It never really went away. Control of Black people's bodies was simply transferred from the plantation owner to the carceral state. The instrument of re-enslavement was a brutal deployment of sheriffs, judges, and hard labor punishment for Black-only offenses such as vagrancy, carrying a firearm, or stealing a pig. African Americans were then swept into the prison system to have their labor fill the coffers of the state and line the pockets of the plantation, mine, and lumber mill owners. Resistance was futile as well, since the groundwork had already been laid for mass murders of Black people without recourse. Lynchings, beatings, rapes, and false imprisonment of Black folks were carried out with impunity across 13 Southern states, and the Johnson administration did nothing to stop it. In Texas alone, nearly 1,000 African Americans were lynched between 1865 and 1868. Indeed, we now have evidence from the Equal Justice Initiative that there were over 4,000 racial terror lynchings after 1877. That's the year the Union troops and Black people's final line of protection were withdrawn from the Southern states. Under such conditions, self-sufficiency could never be achieved. The bottom line was that Black economic independence was anathema to a power structure that depended on cheap, exploitable, rightless labor and required continued Black subordination. And I'm going to pass it over to Kelli.
Well, I'm going to pick up on Claire's narrative there with chapter 2, which is called Derailing the Great Migration. So here Anderson continues to trace white resistance and oppression that was a response to Black advancement. During the Great Migration of 1917, 1918, some 500,000 Black people moved from the southern United States to the north. And I'm going to characterize the Great Migration talking about pushes and pulls, both leading to this movement and then responding to it. So the Great Migration was the result of a push and a pull. The horrendous conditions of the South, which were just so well told by Claire, these systemic things put in place by white elites provided a push, a drive to escape from the Jim Crow laws, from peonage in the sharecropping system, from the dire lack of educational opportunities, and of course, the gruesome spectacle of lynching for crimes only imagined or no crime at all, simply doing well. The comparatively better economic opportunities of the industrial North provided what I would call a pull. So as the South made staying impossible, the North made leaving enticing. But the Great Migration led to, we're not surprised, a backlash of white rage, both in the North and in the South. And here too, there was a pull and a push. Southern whites realized that the Great Migration was a cultural and economic threat to their way of life. Having driven Black people to seek a place that was safer to live, white Southerners used every trick they could to subvert their movement away from the region. They arrested labor agents who advertised promising positions in the North. They cracked down on the press, such as the Chicago Defender. And they refused to sell train tickets to Black people. They punished those who did sell train tickets because there was demand for it. And finally, they simply stopped trains from moving north at all, even though this undermined the ongoing American war efforts in World War I. Such was their desire to pull back after they had pushed away. The states' rights proponents even lobbied the federal government to intervene. And as the Great Migration continued, whites in the North pushed back. Race riots erupted in northern cities in 1919. The KKK took root in many of these cities as well. And housing options for those who had migrated were very diminished in neighborhoods that were undesirable. And this chapter, and I'm doing not as a deep dive into the chapter as Claire did, because I have to do 2 chapters, so I'm trying to use my time well so we can talk. This chapter ends with the heart-wrenching story of Dr. Ossian Sweet. He was a Black doctor in Detroit who wanted to move into a predominantly white neighborhood with very tragic results. He knew others who had been beaten by white mobs, and so he went prepared to defend his home and his family. And as a result of defending his home against people who were trying to kill them, he and his whole family ended up in jail. His family contracted tuberculosis and died, and he eventually took his own life. This kind of tragic result of being in the middle of this seesaw between white Southerners and Northerners during the Great Migration was a really memorable and heart-wrenching story. Chapter 3 is about, it's called Burning Brown to the Ground. The beginning of this chapter describes the vast inequalities in education prior to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education. Anderson details the disparities in student-teacher ratios, for example, between Black students and white students. She describes how drastically unequal funding was in various places all over the states. And I don't feel that I can do it justice in this summary, so I would just point you back to look at the painstaking detail that she's gone to there. The upshot of all of this is that the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson was a patent lie. And at long last, the Supreme Court recognized it with the ruling to integrate schools with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. But of course, this enraged white America. In the North, schools made a show of appearing to be compliant while subverting integration in practice. But the Southern white reaction was much more overt, and they pulled out all the stops. They worked to suppress Black access to the polls. They gerrymandered based on very old census data to decrease Black representation in state and federal government. They touted the doctrine of interposition, that the state could intervene between the federal government and citizens to stop the enforcement of any ruling that the state deemed to be unconstitutional, which in other words is Brown versus the Board of Education. So this was the basis of resisting integration. And finally, they masqueraded all of this under the guise of patriotism. So in the midst of the Cold War, they conflated the NAACP with the boogeyman of communism. I think a key moment illustrates Anderson's point in this chapter. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The Soviets' success in the space race was an American national security crisis, and everyone recognized that the problem lay with American education. It was the key to our progress or our lack thereof. And so the US Congress brought the National Defense Education Act. As they were bringing it to a vote, Carl Elliott, a congressman from Alabama, argued, quote, "Whatever happens in America's classrooms during the next 50 years will eventually happen to America," end of quote. And yet, Elliott and many others ensured that no amendments could be added to this act to require those schools that received funding to comply with integration of schools. Here, Anderson sums up the consequences. Quote, "The refusal to implement Brown throughout the South, even in the face of Sputnik, not only as the law or as simple humanity might have dictated, but also as demanded by national interest and patriotism, compromised and undermined American strength," end quote. The very places that most suppressed Black equal access to education are today the areas in our country with the very worst educational outcomes. As my colleague, Dr. Burton, said earlier this morning, white supremacy destroys us all. And I'll hand over to Robert for chapter 4.
Right, thank you. I have chapters 4 and 5, and like Kelly, I will try to keep my remarks brief so we can have just a little bit more conversation here at the end. As I read this book, I was aware of, and I study empires of the ancient world. And when we talk about empires of the ancient world, we talk about the way that the empires construct and hold power is through domination, through violent structures, and then through hegemony, the non-violent systemic structures of the system. And certainly, Dr. Anderson highlights the violent structures within the system through the lynchings and other things. But it's a very interesting turn, I think, in chapters 4 and 5, where she highlights that the hegemonic structures even more so, though Claire and Kelly have both highlighted some of the problems there as well. And it's also interesting to sort of watch the way that the narrative in the modern United States is that we're such a divided country, and like we've never seen this sort of division before. But if you've read US history, you know that's just untrue. And in particular, I want to just highlight out of chapter 4, the President Richard Nixon, right? I mean, the power of the reaction to the civil rights movement, not only with the murder of Dr. King and of Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, but also of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and just sort of the gutting of this leadership that was moving the nation in a direction of racial justice, right, was undermined by violence, but it was also undermined by the vote and the placement of Richard Nixon as president of the United States. And one of the things that I didn't know before I read the book the first time was, for example, that Nixon had the power of the Supreme Court, echoes ringing in our ears at this particular point, where he appointed 4 justices to the Supreme Court, who, in addition to an appointee by Dwight D. Eisenhower, undermined the Brown versus Board of Education decision years ago, even more so. There's a story in the chapter where the San Antonio, Texas brings people from a community in San Antonio, Texas say, look, there's discrimination in our system. Poor African-American and Hispanic students are getting barely $21 worth of taxpayer funding for their educational system, while in a rich neighborhood, they're getting nearly $1,500. So she puts it as a 1,500% more increased funding for a wealthy neighborhood compared to a poor neighborhood. That case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides against the people who are bringing the suit. And the justices say, in fact, there is no constitutional right to education. One of the worst things I think you can ever, I mean, just when it's just bold there in black and white, and the Supreme Court justices are writing in this way, right, that there is no right to education. Knowing that years before, the Declaration of Human Rights had named it as one of the major international human rights. And yet the courts, the Supreme Court of the United States said, in fact, there is no such right. Now, Nixon is known for lots of other things, right? And there's lots of things we could say, but certainly the war on drugs is born in the Nixon era, right? And sort of the violence that's enacted against the war on drugs, and so therefore against African-American neighborhoods, right, in particular, is something that I think many of us have heard, but again, Dr. Anderson does a great job of underlining some of those things. I decided, though, I didn't want to spend too much time in history, because we do that, and sometimes we act like this is all in the past, right? But Dr. Anderson's book comes all the way to the present, 2017, right? Her book's only 3 years old, and she spends a good time in the 5th chapter writing about various ways that the constitutional rights were undermined, especially in regard to voting rights. So the Voting Rights Act, right, some of you are aware of this, but watching her just sort of outline it in one chapter is almost breathtakingly horrifying, right? It's like watching a horror movie and you can't pull your eyes away from it, right? She talks about the Supreme Court justices undermining Part 4B of the Voting Rights Act, which required supervision of Congress whenever a state district decided it was going to change its voting rights laws. And what they said was, well, that was based on data written 40 years ago. So John Roberts was the lead person writing for the statement for the decision. It was based on 40 years ago, and we've come so far and seen so many changes, right, in the nature of race relations in the United States, that this is an outdated law. Now, our recently deceased champion of justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wrote against that severely. She's like, we actually haven't tested the theory to see whether or not the world has changed in the way that Justice Roberts has written about. And in fact, what happened, as Dr. Anderson points out, is, states jumped on this immediately, right? And, I think it was all the way back with Dr. Frederick's comment sort of early on, right? Unless you were convicted of a crime, right? That was this big change, this comment in the law regarding whether you could be enslaved in various ways. But one of the things that happened, right, was, for example, the state of Florida has it that if you've committed a felony crime, even once you've paid all paid your debt to society, as they say, right, you have to wait 14 more years beyond that before you have the right to vote. And as Dr. Anderson points out, in a state that's contested quite frequently, like the state of Florida, where there were 1.7 million people who had been convicted of various felony acts, though some of them are the most ridiculous sorts of things you've ever heard of, right? And I don't remember them all at the moment. I didn't write them all down on my thing, right? But I mean, 1.7 million people being disenfranchised of their vote, right? The majority of them being African-American, think again, the war on drugs, et cetera, right? And suddenly, right, you have these states who have said, the door is now open. And so I did a further search on this, right? 880 different cases were brought in Ohio, Iowa, Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, so many different places where people were trying to change voter rights laws, right? And so various things that would disenfranchise people from voter IDs to, if you had one piece of returned mail from your post office box, right? If it got sent back, then they would take you off the voter roll. I mean, how would you even know sometimes that one piece of mail was returned from your voter mailbox? I mean, I guess I might have been disenrolled myself, right? If you misspelled a word on your writing ballot, if you were sending in your ballot and you wrote it in and you mailed it in and there was a misspelled word, there was a literacy test in certain places where you could be disenfranchised from your vote, right? And so all these different ways, these states said, when the voting rights, a central tenet of the Voting Rights Act was undermined, that Part 4B, right? States jumped all over that, right? And they worked in various ways to get these things. And as we were talking about this the other day, it became clear to me, some of you are living in Texas, and Greg Abbott, who is the constructor of some of these things as the district attorney of the state, suddenly is governor. I live in the state of Georgia. Brian Kemp, who was the person who constructed these prohibitive laws in the state of Georgia, is now governor of the state, right? And so when you see the way that power reinforces power, right? So you take one simple thing, right? Part 4B of the Voting Rights Act, and you have this white rage that doesn't express itself. It does express itself in ways of mass incarceration and the murder of African Americans and Latinx people in the streets, or someone like Sandra Bland, being hanged in her jail cell in Texas or whatever, right? That does happen, but that white rage is playing out in these constitutional, overturning constitutional rights, so that white people can maintain power and hold people in oppressive and suppressive situations. And of course, there's a lot more that could be said here, but I'm going to turn it back over to Travis.
Thank you, Robert, Kelli, and Claire. Wow. I think, Robert, you kind of nailed it when you said, there's pieces of this that we know, but seeing it laid out just in black and white really just shows how systemic it all has been, how devious white rage is. I hope you can see that these repeated historical patterns since the Civil War of Blacks gaining opportunity and rights and whites raging against their advancement, this is repeated over and over again. This is the script we're handed at every turn in our history. White people, fragile and scared of losing their unearned power, who threw fits in legislatures, courtrooms, bureaucracies to break laws, change laws, twist laws to curtail Black advancement and preserve white supremacy. White people creating a war on drugs by buying drugs from Nicaragua, funding drug lords, shipping those drugs to our cities, turning their heads while they were sold, thus creating a drug problem that didn't exist, so that then they could rage against the drug problem and arrest Black people. And in the Cold War, it is devious, it is evil, it is sinful. And this is not just a story, this is America's story. This is a part of our national character. And so much systemic effort has been made to placate the rage of whites. The book ends with an afterword, which she rewrote in the paperback edition. And I had originally listened to the Audible edition, which is based on the original edition. So I didn't even know this existed till I paid closer attention a few days ago. But originally it was called Imagining, and the new afterword she calls After the Election, Imagining. And it's still early on. I think she wrote it probably around 2017, but she reflects on the election of Donald Trump and how white people in power who had during the campaign been deeply critical of Trump's candidacy, demeanor, policy suggestions, risky behaviors, and risky relationships, then turned and ignored all of that to support him as president because they believed that he was, her quote, America's last chance to recreate a nation that reminded them of the good old days, the country's growing diversity, Obama's very existence in the White House, and the ever-increasing visibility of African Americans in colleges and corporations had fueled a sense that these gains were likely to reduce the influence of white Americans in society. And so Trump's win exposed in frightening ways the ethno-nationalist rage centered around a Black president, and the fear that all of the resources and wealth that had been accumulated through centuries of public policy by white people would be subject to redistribution from older white America to a younger, more diverse population. And so she says the recipe to make America great is a neo-apartheid world that includes heightened voter suppression, legalizing racial profiling and policing, weakening laws that protect labor, stopping cities from raising the minimum wage, defunding nutritional assistance for hungry children, ensuring the electoral college stays in place to insulate the white establishment against changing demographics. In other words, our history is our present. It's still happening today. And it's all very depressing and made so much worse by the still raging pandemic. But believe it or not, our author is hopeful. After walking through all this, she does call the afterword imagining, for she sees during this time there is a rage developing against white rage. As thousands, she says, take to the streets to march, as lawsuit after lawsuit rains down on the courts, as boycott after boycott sends the economic and cultural message of an empowered and unbowed people, as honest, fact-based dialogues about race and racism converge with those on class, sexual orientation, and gender. They say we are one. And she says this is how we begin to diffuse the power of white rage, in a sense, turning the tactics of white rage against itself to undermine it. And the future that should be, could be, she says, if we will it to be. Imagine, she asks us, what America could have been for all of us if Reconstruction had been honored, if Brown had been implemented, if King's beloved community was made a reality, if communities weren't intentionally infected with drugs, if billions of dollars were not spent fighting an alleged war on drugs or funding a criminal justice system, full voting rights were given to all Americans, and if the hope of our first Black president had truly been harnessed. We shouldn't have to imagine, she says, for that future is still possible if we will it to be. She ends in this way: this is the moment now when all of us, Black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian American, must step out of the shadow of white rage, deny its power, understand its unseemly goals, and refuse to be seduced by its buzzwords, dog whistles, and sophistry. This is when we choose a different future. Now, she ends her book with optimism. And I think we're going to attempt to do that ourselves in our panel. I want to ask my other three panelists, are you, after reading and reflecting on this, after spending the day together, are you also optimistic? And I'll just throw whoever wants to start.
I wanted to jump back on something that Robert said about the disenfranchised voters today, you know, and how we can help. This is something I'm hopeful about because I've seen some churches, Raphael Warnock's church down in Georgia. They have taken this up as a ministry to come behind some of these folks who have been disenfranchised, because sometimes the only thing that stands between someone who's paid their time, but they can't pay their court fines, they're in court debt. And so a lot of times that court debt is the last thing that stands between that person and having their right to vote restored. And I think that's such a great ministry that churches could get involved in and come alongside people who need their help with their court debt, get their voting rights restored. And again, just have a whole population of people have that right and that agency back.
So I think the answer is yes and no, right? I want to go to the last conversation about Black rage and anger, right? There was all that thing that was going on in the chat. Some of you know that I got into an argument in the pages of Christianity Today with Andy Stanley, who had said that Christians should unhitch themselves from the Old Testament. And part of the reason he said that was because of the moral problems that he sees in the Old Testament. And I find it very suspicious that a powerful white preacher says we should unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament, because that's where we do see predominantly the anger of God, the anger of the prophets, the predominant call to justice in many various forms, right? And so when we have this, I am totally discouraged by the national white discourse of the John MacArthurs and the Andy Stanleys of the world and others who are saying the right of things that they're saying. This was the one example with me and Andy Stanley having this discussion. And but at the same time, I'm encouraged that Christianity Today took up that challenge and in fact published, including an essay by our good friend, Jerry Taylor, on why we should have the First Testament of our scriptures, right? And so I'm discouraged in some ways because white churches are a part of the problem, and sometimes these dominant white preachers are a part of this problem. At the same time, the congregation I'm a part of has 7 study groups going on right now that are reading books like White Rage and White Fragility and whatever the group decided to study to really make this an important part of it. What does it mean to be a disciple in the United States in 2020? It means to confront these sorts of issues and ask these questions about why didn't we talk about it when we were growing up? Why did our preachers never say anything to us about this history? What are we going to do about these sort of situations in the present? So there are things that I'm discouraged by, and yet at the same time, like in the congregation where I'm at, I can see the people trying to deal with this as a question of discipleship in 2020, and I'm encouraged by that.
I think if I were to answer this question, I kind of share some of that mixed reaction. It's hard for me to look at the overt racism that we've seen in the last several years. So one thing that Claire mentioned when we were talking about the book earlier in the week is she said, you know, Dr. Anderson seems, she's emphasizing how this is kind of under the surface. It's working in these official channels, and I see it overtly. It isn't hidden anymore. And actually it hasn't ever been hidden if we would just look. And so there's that part of me that is very distressed to see how open white supremacist groups can be now. But I also think that the way that it's forcing us to really look gives me some hope too, because I think I will confess that there have been periods in my life when I was ignorant of a lot of what happened before. And simply the knowledge of this has, you know, kindled a new kind of rage, a rage for justice in me. And actually anger isn't really like an emotion that I'm very much in touch with most of the time. It's part of my social conditioning, I think. But it's the right feeling here. And learning to help, especially those of us who are disciples of Christ, name and recognize and be honest about the whole truth without pulling back. I think that is hopeful. So I'll end on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Travis.
No, go.
I was just going to say too, I agree with Kelly. The white rage has always been a both and. It's always been visible, violent, lynching, you know, burning of Black Wall Street, you know, turning the hoses on the teenagers in Kelly Ingram Park, Selma, Bloody Sunday. I mean, it's always been both and, right? It's been insidious policies and structures and systemic ways to disenfranchise people of color. But so, and like you, I see it emboldened in today's rhetoric, with some of the rhetoric coming from the top and our leaders. But what I'm hopeful about is the new generation too, just like the Children's March in Birmingham, which was high school students. I work with high school students who they want to change the world, right? And they want a connection between their faith in Jesus and what's going on in the here and now. You know, if salvation is just about what happens when we die and it has nothing to say about systems of justice and jubilee and freedom for the oppressed in this life, you know, they're not interested. So I think one hope I see is it's for teachers and preachers to connect for young people that the Christian faith has much to say about the weightier matters of the law, which is justice and mercy and faithfulness. And they want a faith that is active, that's out in the community, you know, fixing and changing the world and being the change they want to see. So when I see their enthusiasm and that they still have hope, that gives me hope.
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of reflecting as you all were talking just about this idea of anger and rage. And in some ways, you know, that in my bio mentioned my work with the Industrial Areas Foundation. One of the lessons we teach leaders is that anger is a good thing. Anger is a tool, but hot anger gets you in trouble. But cold anger is anger that has been crafted and narrowed and focused and can be used to change systems and to motivate and to you know, wake us up out of our complacency. And we're scared of that though, especially white Christians, because we have this rage, and a lot of times it's focused, well, why is everybody so upset at everything? Why can't we just all get along? This book answers that question, why we can't, because we don't want to, because white getting along has always been built on the backs of Black people. And to make progress we have to undo that. What I have seen in my work with organizing these institutes in cities across the country that are made up of multiracial, multi-faith organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, unions, nonprofits, they come together out of a shared self-interest. And that doesn't sound too Christian, really, because, you know, Christ emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. But the work of organizing is politics. And in politics, we realize that people act out of their own self-interest. And I believe white Christians have for too long bought into the lie that it is in our self-interest for Black and brown and Native peoples to be oppressed. When in reality, what this book shows us is that it has harmed us all. And we've almost squandered the entire promise of our nation and billions of dollars of wealth in order to preserve something that continues to harm us. And if that doesn't make us angry, I don't know what could. But what makes me hopeful is that there are people, as she said, waking up, trying new things, running for office, organizing themselves, not buying into the lie. What makes me hopeful is when you read this afterward and you see just how many efforts of voter suppression that have happened in the last 4 years, and to know that that is, you know, the death throes of a system that knows that it can't win unless it keeps people from voting. That is hopeful because things are changing. In Des Moines, a bunch of religious people, you know, organized to raise our taxes, to create this sales tax on a ballot initiative, passed it. Why? So that roads across the city, but in particular in Black neighborhoods, could be repaired that had been ignored, that libraries could stay open in Black neighborhoods longer, that houses that were blighted could be torn down, and other community investments, you know. And why would people act like that? Because taxes, those are in against our self-interest. Well, no, because they began to see, as they had conversations across the community, that this was good for everyone. It makes our community better. It makes our properties worth more. You know, it can be a selfish thing. How many people have moved out of, old white women have to leave their home to move to a place they don't know because they're scared, because their community does not invest in those neighborhoods. And so my hope is in white people waking up and beginning to see that it is in our self-interest to move out of the shadow of white rage. And I think it's the church more than any institution that can lead that way as it casts this hope, this future, the kingdom of God, as Jesus called it, the beloved community, as Dr. King called it. The future that is possible, the dream of America that is not real, but could still be real if we imagine it and will it and go and do the work to make it so. And I believe that would then be the first time that America probably has actually ever been great, but it could be our greatest moment of all. Thank you to the Spain Center again, to Dr. Taylor, to our esteemed moderator, Byron, and to my panelists. Any final thoughts? I think we're out of time. All right.
Thank you so much, Travis. Thank you, Kelly, Claire, and Robert, so much for unpacking that. I think it was very powerful, and it was y'all were talking. I kept thinking about a radio show that I participate in called The Morning Black, where Black is an acronym for Building Leaders in Cultural Knowledge. But one of the conversations that we get into on there is the construct of the Cartesian mindset versus a Kemetic mindset, and how when we exist in that Cartesian mindset that I think, therefore I am, our main fear is scarcity. And when you're scared, it shows up as rage. It shows up as a lot of times as anger. And we're seeing that and unpacking that. When you unpack that pathology, we can start to actually do some work. And y'all were doing some work today unpacking that pathology. So thank you so much